Scripture this morning is from Proverbs 15. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Proverbs 15, verses 1 through 4. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit.
Last week, we introduced our study of the fruit of gentleness, and we focused on understanding what gentleness means. Because as we noted last week, in our culture, gentleness is associated with weakness, timidity, with being spineless, being a doormat, being soft. But in the first century, when Jesus said, "I am gentle and lowly," gentleness referred to not weakness, but strength. Strength brought under control like an animal, a wild animal that has been tamed. We need to keep that understanding of gentleness in the forefront of our mind as we continue studying this wonderful fruit, this underrated fruit, to be honest. Remember that gentleness is strength under control. But how is it supposed to manifest itself in our lives? How is gentleness going to be experienced by other people as a fruit we are producing? There's a story I heard about a teacher who was talking to her little children about whales in class at school. And one little girl raised her hand and asked, "Do whales swallow people?" And the teacher said, "No. Even though they are much bigger than a person, they have throat pleats that filter their food of krill and plankton." And the little girl said, "But Jonah was swallowed by a whale." And the teacher was getting very frustrated with this line of discussion. And she said, "Whales cannot swallow people, period." The little girl said, "Well, when I get to heaven, I'll just ask Jonah if he was really swallowed by a whale." And the teacher said, "Well, what if Jonah doesn't go to heaven?" The little girl said, "Well, then you can ask him." Now that was meant for a good laugh, but also notice that was not gentle. That was not a gentle communication by either party in that story. And that's what we need to understand. Gentleness is really about communication first and foremost. One of the primary, if not the primary way your gentleness is going to be known is by the way you communicate with other people. And so we turn our attention to Proverbs chapter 15 and these first 4 verses because it indicates that the primary manifestation of our gentleness is going to be our words. And we're just going to spend the focus of our time on these 4 verses here in Proverbs 15. And I know we just read it a moment ago, but I want to read it again. I want to read it this time from a different translation. So in Proverbs chapter 15, here's the first 4 verses again. "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise adorns knowledge, but the mouth of the fool gushes folly. The eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit." Just a couple of quick observations. It's quite obvious that Solomon here is focused on our words, focused on our speech habits, focused on the way we communicate with people. Because the terms answer, words, tongue, mouth, these words are all addressing our speech. So notice that's the emphasis, that's the primary focus here in these first few verses of Proverbs 15. Also notice the use of the word gentle, which is obviously the reason we're in this passage today. Now, I find it fascinating to compare these 4 verses across multiple translations because the translations vary in their use of the word gentle. While the NIV and the New American Standard Version, for that matter, uses gentle in verse 1 and soothing in verse 4, you'll see some differences. For instance, the ESV, it uses the combination of the words soft in verse 1 and gentle in verse 4. Maybe that's where the toilet paper got its name. Yeah, that didn't go over. The New Living Translation uses gentle twice. Once in verse 1, once in verse 4. The New King James Version never uses the word gentle. It uses soft in verse 1, wholesome in verse 4. So, what is gentle here? There's 2 different words in verse 1 and verse 4. 2 different Hebrew words being used, but they both relate to gentleness. Solomon's objective is to get the reader to understand that how we respond to and communicate with others dictates how it's going to be received. It demonstrates our character, and it determines whether or not our words will have a positive impact or a negative impact. So we're going to walk ourselves through this passage today so that when it comes to the fruit of gentleness, we will talk the talk and not just walk the walk. Because the way we speak demonstrates our gentleness. So start with me in the first verse here where Solomon says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." As we've already noted, the term translated gentle here is sometimes translated soft. And the language of soft can be a turnoff for many of us because softness is not valued in our culture. But again, don't forget that gentleness is strength under control. That's the idea. Not weakness, not cowardice. Strength under control. So the idea Solomon is conveying here is that a response that is tempered, a response that is measured and not emotionally charged, is capable of extinguishing the heightened emotional state of the one being addressed. A soft answer or a gentle answer is one that's tempered, measured, controlled, emotionally stable, because the objective is to combat wrath, anger, and the emotionally charged other side of the conversation. It should be noted that Solomon will later say in Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 15, "With patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone." Some translations will say a gentle tongue will break a bone. What? How do words, especially gentle or soft words, break bones? The idea behind what Solomon is saying is that a well-timed, considerate response can have a powerful impact. What we need to realize is that gentleness in our communication is not really about us. It's about the other person. A gentle answer helps determine the responsiveness of the person we're addressing. When we're harsh or brash or loud or caustic, it will typically produce a visceral, defensive response from the other person. You've experienced this. When you go into a conversation, when you're dealing with somebody and communicating with them, and you're just yelling at the top of your lungs, or you're sarcastic, or you're just harsh. It's going to cause them to put up a wall or pull away or respond in kind. And so Solomon here in his wisdom is saying, don't do that. In your communication, be gentle, be thoughtful, be considerate, be timely even. I wonder whether Solomon reflected on his father's experience with a couple named Nabal and Abigail as he penned these words. You can read their story, the interaction of David with those two individuals in 1 Samuel chapter 25. I don't have it on the screen, but if you want to peruse it, 1 Samuel chapter 25 is where that is recorded. And what happens in 1 Samuel 25 is that David is a fugitive from Saul, so he's on the run, he's living out in the wild. And to make ends meet, he occasionally hires out him and his men for service to others. In particular, on this occasion, he has sort of voluntarily served as a protective service for a guy named Nabal. What that means is, during that time period, Philistines would often raid the countryside of Israel. And they would, at harvest time, come in and take all of the produce, or they would steal the livestock. And so what David and his men did, as others did as well, is he provided security for Nabal's men and animals during the harvest season. Now, you may have noticed I mentioned that it was voluntary, but it was customary too. The custom was that if somebody protected your stuff like that, then when you reaped your harvest and made your wealth off of it, then you would give them something. There would be some sort of compensation for the services rendered. Well, it came time for that compensation to be paid, so David sent some of his men to Nabal to retrieve it. When they got there, Nabal blew them off. In fact, you can read in 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 10 and 11. Nabal says, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed from my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" He acts like he doesn't know them. If you skip down to verse 14, one of his servants tells his wife that he reviled them, as the English Standard Version says. That he spoke angrily to them, as the New American Standard Version says. That he railed at them or he hurled insults at them, all depending on the translation that you read. In other words, Nabal was rude. Nabal was harsh. Nabal was anything but gentle. And you know how David reacted? Remember when I said that if you respond harshly, you respond loudly, you respond sarcastically, it usually triggers something in another person that's a defensive measure? Well, for David, it wasn't that he pulled away. It wasn't that he responded in kind. Instead, he upped the ante. He went and told all of his men to get their weapons because they're going to go kill Nabal. David was so offended by the way his men were treated by Nabal that he's taking matters into his own hands. On his way there, though, news of Nabal's foolishness gets shared with his wife, Abigail. And so, Abigail intervenes. And you can read her words to David in verses 24 through 31 of 1 Samuel 25. But what's most important is that she's the epitome of gentleness. She humbles herself before David. As soon as she gets in David's presence, she falls at his feet, bows before him, and then she takes responsibility for her husband's failings. She doesn't excuse what her husband did. She takes the blame for not being present to counteract it. She apologizes and asks for David's forgiveness. But most importantly, she reminded David who he is. She reminded him of the promise God had made to him regarding the throne, and she reminded David of his reputation as a man after God's own heart. She spoke in the future tense about his reign, but she spoke in the present tense about his reputation. Her gentle, timely words calmed David down. And David didn't proceed with the sinful actions he had planned. In fact, Abigail's gentle words were so powerful that when Nabal dies like 10 days later, David waits the appropriate amount of time and then he asks her to marry him because he realized she was a benefit to him, all due to the gentleness with which she communicated. You see, Nabal is the epitome of harsh words. Abigail is the epitome of gentle words. And we're called by Solomon to follow in Abigail's footsteps, to be ones that communicate gently, not harshly. Because gentle words have the ability to extinguish the fire of anger. Not only that, you keep reading what Solomon has to say, and you get to verse 2 of Proverbs 15. He says, "The tongue of the wise adorns knowledge, but the mouth of the fool gushes folly." While verse 1 of this proverb addresses the product of our words, whether they are gentle or harsh, verse 2 is actually addressing the source of our words. The point Solomon is making is that gentleness is the product of a tongue guided by wisdom. Harshness is the product of a tongue guided by foolishness. In other words, you demonstrate whether you are a wise or foolish person based on whether or not your communication is under control or out of control. For this particular verse, in this passage, I actually prefer the New American Standard Version and the New Living Translation because New American Standard says, "The tongue of the wise makes knowledge pleasant." The New Living Translation says, "The tongue of the wise makes knowledge appealing." This means that the way you communicate can either be attractive or distasteful. The way you speak can draw people to what you have to say or can push people away. One commentator said it this way. He said, "The wise have tongues controlled by loving emotions and sound thought, and so speak in a way that makes their internalized knowledge of the moral order attractive." A gentle answer draws people in, while a tongue or a harsh word pushes them away. You're either a building block of relationship with the way you communicate, or you're a wrecking ball of relationship by the way you communicate. That's what Solomon's trying to communicate to us here in verse 2 after he's already addressed the gentle word and the harsh word. It demonstrates whether or not you're wise or foolish. It makes you attractive or unattractive to others. And then in verse 3, Solomon said, "The eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good." This seems out of place. It seems like it doesn't belong because it jumps from the subject of speech and communication to the nature of God. But there is a reason for the reference to God's omniscience here. Solomon's making the point that God sees everything, and the implication is that he also hears everything. Just as there are no actions that go unnoticed by God, there are no words that are unheard by him. In fact, in Solomon chapter 139, verse 4, it said that even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. God knows what you're going to say before you even say it. And he knows how you're going to say it before you say it. And realize this, Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 12 The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, in the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Solomon just said, God sees both the wicked and the good. Jesus said that there is either good or wickedness being produced in you. And it's going to come out through your words. So in the midst of this presentation on how we communicate, Solomon appealed to God's omniscience, and an omniscience that not only sees what we do, but hears what we say, knows what we think, and knows how we communicate. So we need to be intentional about employing the type of speech that he deems good and avoiding the type of speech that he deems wicked. Clearly, in the context of this passage, a gentle answer is good, while a harsh word is wicked. And notice the final thing Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 15. He said, I got to get to this one. The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit. In this verse, Solomon returns to the comparison between the two types of communication. A gentle answer and a wise tongue are associated with a soothing tongue here, while harsh words in the mouth of a fool are associated with a perverse tongue. The point Solomon is making is that gentleness in our speech brings about healing, while harshness results in destruction. It's interesting that there is this allusion to the tree of life here. Do you realize that there are only 3 books in the Bible that use that phrase, tree of life? Genesis, Proverbs, Revelation. Here's what's interesting. By appealing to the tree of life, Solomon is producing a callback to the Garden of Eden, where that life-sustaining tree resided in the middle. But it's also a call forward to the book of Revelation, where that same tree is depicted in heaven, providing healing to the nations, according to Revelation chapter 22 and verse 2. And so Solomon compares a soothing tongue, a gentle word, to something that provides healing and life in the Bible. In fact, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 24 says that gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. Gentle communication can heal. Harsh communication can hurt. That's the point Solomon's making. But the only way it's possible for gentle words to accomplish their healing function is for them to also be truthful. You notice, if I go back to the verse here, soothing tongue is compared, or contrasted, I should say, with a perverse tongue. The word for perverse here doesn't just refer to that which is immoral. It primarily focuses on that which is dishonest, that which is untruthful, that which is false. Gentle words are not just kind words. They're not just tender words. They're not just words that make things comfortable and peaceful. They're words that speak the truth. Realize this, if you go back to the book of Galatians where the fruits of the Spirit are mentioned, they're at the end of the book. Gentleness is identified. You go back a couple of chapters to Galatians chapter 2. There is a situation in which Peter is not being a Christian. He's being a hypocrite. And Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2 that he had to call Peter out. He had to confront Peter on this issue. But he's also telling us the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. Same book, same author, same train of thought. What that means is that sometimes you have to confront people with the truth, and it can be done gently. You know what the gentle way was? The fact that he pulled him aside. He didn't do it in front of everybody. Paul didn't confront and correct Peter so that the whole congregation saw it and were like, ooh, you know how we do when somebody gets in trouble? No. He pulled him aside, spoke to him bluntly but gently. And it seems Peter got the message. It seems to have worked. So we need to understand that gentle words are also truthful words. They're not just soft, easy words that make somebody happy. But we also need to understand that gentle words are about taking the thoughts and emotions of the other person into consideration. We need to care about telling people the truth. We need to be able to tell them to stop doing this or to stop doing that, or we need to offer correction on this front or that front. But we need to address it in such a way that we're taking into consideration how it's going to impact them. What's the best way to approach this in a loving way? And a loving way is not just saying, hey, you know, I'm just here in love. No, that's not a loving way. A loving way is actually loving them as you say it. Actually caring about the way it's going to impact them. Caring about the way they're going to hear it so that it's received in grace just as it's spoken in grace. I listened to a podcast not too long ago on the subject of gentleness, and one of the speakers on it pointed out that the metaphor Jesus uses for how we should impact the world is by being the salt of the earth. He said, but far too often Christians want to be the wasabi of the earth. We just want to come in hot and leave people uncomfortable. But that's not what Jesus called us to do. He called us to be the salt of the earth, which provides healing, which adds flavor, not making things worse. You see, in these short 4 verses, Solomon calls our attention to what gentleness in our communication looks like. Sometimes gentleness in our communication also includes being quiet. If you think about what James instructed us to do, James, the wisdom writer of the New Testament, be quick to listen and slow to what? Speak. Gentleness is birthed out of slowness sometimes because it causes us to be intentional and measured with our words. Gentleness allows us time to process and consider what we need to say and the way we need to say it. So the ultimate question for today is whether or not your words are gentle or not. That's the 3rd time I've used whether or not incorrectly. And I'm not just talking about the words you speak. Because one of the worst places for gentleness to exist is on social media. Some of you have no gentle filter on your keyboard. I say some of you because I don't have social media. So for once, I don't have to get on to myself. We sometimes allow our wall of gentleness that's supposed to filter the way we communicate, we let it drop when we go to the keyboard. Gentleness isn't just about your one-on-one times, texting on your phone, emailing somebody, posting on social media. Whatever means of communication you use is expected to be controlled through the filter of gentleness. Because gentleness heals. Because gentleness puts out the fires of anger. Because gentleness is an expression of wisdom. And because gentleness has the ability to attract others towards you. This morning, as we continue our study of gentleness, understand that your communication is expected to be gentle. Understand that you have a Father who's aware of what you communicate and how you communicate. And understand that it is something for which you will be judged one day. This morning, as we reflect on gentleness in this fashion, if you realize you have not been gentle, and I'll be honest, I have not. My wife, my children can attest to the fact that I'm not always gentle. So I'm certain every one of us could come forward today to admit that we haven't been gentle with somebody. If you're struggling to produce the fruit of gentleness, particularly in your communication, well, now's the time for a fresh start. It starts with acknowledging it, admitting that you struggle with it, allowing God to take it over. And maybe that's where you're at today. Maybe you have not become a child of God and learned this strength under control that comes when He tames you. And you need to make that decision today. Whatever your need is, we offer the invitation for you to come, make it known, and make it right. All together we stand and sing.
I am